Morning arrived quietly over the mountains of Honaker, Virginia. A thin blanket of fog rested across the valley as Sage made her way toward the barn one final time. The horses seemed to know something was different. Several watched quietly from their stalls as she approached. Standing near the doorway was Willard. For as long as Sage could remember, Willard had been there. Most folks in town avoided him years ago. Rumors followed him everywhere. Some said he'd robbed banks in his younger days. Others claimed he'd ridden with outlaws somewhere out west. Nobody knew for certain. What everyone did know was that Willard could ride a horse better than any man in 3 counties. And when Sage was just a little girl, her grandmother had trusted him to teach her. By the time she was 16, Sage could outride most of the men in Honaker. Willard had seen to that. Now, after all these years, saying goodbye felt harder than she expected. "You sure about this?" Willard asked softly. Sage smiled, though her eyes were already beginning to water. "No." The old horseman chuckled. "That's probably the smartest answer you've given me." For a moment neither of them spoke. The morning breeze carried the scent of hay and leather through the barnyard. Finally, Sage reached into her satchel and withdrew a small leather pouch. Willard immediately shook his head. "No." Sage smiled. "You don't even know what it is." "I know exactly what it is." He folded his arms. "And I'm not taking it." Sage stepped closer and pressed the pouch into his weathered hands. "Yes, you are." The old horseman frowned. "Sage, I sold the house." "I know. I sold the business." "I know that too." She gently closed his fingers around the pouch. "Then you know I've got enough to make this trip." Willard looked down at the weight of the coins in his hand. "Sage, I can't." "Sure you can." His eyes met hers. "I owe you more than I'll ever repay." The old man looked away. "You don't owe me a thing." She smiled softly. "You taught me to ride." Willard chuckled. "Lord help the men of Honaker. I surely did." "You looked after Grandma." His smile faded. "I promised her I would." Sage's eyes glistened. "And now I'm asking you to promise me something." "What?" "Take care of yourself." Willard stared at the pouch for several moments before finally slipping it into his coat pocket. "You're stubborn." Sage laughed. "Learned from the best." The old horseman shook his head, then settled his hat beneath his arm. After a moment he asked, "Where exactly are you headed after Bristol?" "Virginia City, Montana." The old horseman blinked. For a moment he looked genuinely surprised. "Virginia City?" Sage nodded. "That's where Granddad lived before he was killed." Willard slowly rubbed his beard. "Well, now." A faint smile crossed his weathered face. "That's a place I know." Sage looked at him curiously. "You've been there?" "Been there?" Willard chuckled. "Girl, I was born outside Virginia City." Sage stared at him. "You were?" "Sure was." The old horseman leaned against the barn doorway. "My daddy worked the mines until the day he passed." Sage had known Willard most of her life, yet somehow they'd never had this conversation. "I never knew that." Most folks never asked. His eyes drifted toward the mountains. "When I was a boy, me and my cousin spent half our lives around those mines." Sage smiled. "Doing what?" "Whatever they needed," he laughed. "Mostly staying out of trouble." Sage raised an eyebrow. "Mostly?" "Well," Willard grinned. "That's the version I'm telling." Both of them laughed. Then his expression softened. "Back then, once the miners brought gold into the holding room, me and my cousin sometimes carried it where it needed to go." Sage's eyes widened. "You carried gold?" "Oh, not much at a time," he shrugged, "but enough to make a young boy feel important." For a moment, he seemed lost in memories. Then he looked back at her. Virginia City was a different place then. "What do you mean?" Willard's smile faded slightly. "There was money everywhere." His voice grew quieter. "And whenever there's money everywhere," he paused, "there's usually trouble hiding nearby." Sage studied him carefully. "Sounds like you know more than you're saying." The old horseman laughed. "Sounds like your grandmother raised a smart girl." Sage stepped closer and gave him a playful wink. "Well, Willard," she adjusted her gloves, "I might be calling on you before this is all over." The old horseman smiled. "If you do." He settled his hat back onto his head. "You know where to find me." Then after a pause, he added quietly, "And Sage?" "Yes?" If you find answers out there, his eyes drifted toward the distant mountains. Be careful what else you uncover. Something in his voice caused her smile to fade. It wasn't fear she heard. It was experience. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sage stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him one final time. Willard hugged her tightly, longer than either intended. When they finally pulled apart, Sage brushed away a tear and smiled. "I better go get changed before I miss my train." Willard nodded. "Wouldn't want that." She laughed softly, then reached for his hand. "I wish you well, Willard." The old horseman squeezed her fingers. "And I wish you safe travels, girl." Sage glanced toward the farmhouse one last time. "I'll send a card as soon as I get settled." "You better." "I will. So I'll know you're still alive and raising trouble somewhere." That earned a genuine laugh from her. As Sage turned and started toward the house, she paused once and looked back. Willard stood exactly where she'd left him, one hand resting on the barn door, the horses watching quietly behind him. A piece of home she'd carry with her forever. Then she continued toward the house. The next time she stepped outside, she'd be dressed for travel and heading west. By mid-morning, dark clouds had gathered over the mountains of Honaker, Virginia. A steady rain began falling as workers loaded Sage's trunks onto the waiting wagon. The old farmhouse stood quietly behind her. For a moment, she simply stared at it. Every porch board, every window, every memory. This had been home her entire life. Now it belonged to someone else. The sale was complete. The papers were signed. There was nothing left to do except leave. Sage adjusted her traveling hat and watched as the final trunk was secured. Inside those trunks were all the things she considered worth carrying across the country: clothing, family photographs, letters, important documents, and the silver watch that had started everything, the watch containing a mystery no one had yet explained. As the rain continued to fall, Sage climbed into the wagon and took one final look at the house, the place where she had laughed, the place where she had grieved, the place where her grandmother had raised her. Then she turned toward the road. The journey west had begun. Hours later, the wagon rolled into Bristol, Tennessee. Steam drifted through the station yard as passengers hurried along the platform. Porters moved luggage carts between trains while conductors shouted final boarding instructions. Sage stepped toward the ticket window and handed the station agent her travel information. "I'll need passage to St. Louis." The agent nodded and began writing. "And after St. Louis?" "Montana." The man glanced up. "Montana's a mighty long way from Virginia." Sage smiled politely. "So I've been told." Within minutes, he handed her 2 tickets. One would carry her from Bristol to St. Louis. The second would continue westward across the plains and into Montana territory. Sage studied the worn paper tickets in her hand. 2 small pieces of paper, 2,000 miles from everything she had ever known. There was no turning back now. The whistle sounded. Passengers began moving toward the train. Porters loaded trunks into baggage cars. The great iron locomotive hissed and breathed clouds of steam into the Tennessee morning. Sage tucked the tickets safely into her traveling satchel and boarded. Soon afterward, she settled into her seat beside a window. As the train slowly pulled away from Bristol, the mountains of Virginia drifted past outside. She watched until they disappeared completely. For the first few hours, she occupied herself with a small book she had packed for the journey. But eventually the passing countryside stole her attention. Fields gave way to rivers. Rivers gave way to open farmland. Small towns appeared and vanished. Church steeples rose from distant hillsides. Farmhouses dotted the landscape. The farther west they traveled, the larger the country seemed to become. Day melted into evening. Evening gave way to another morning. By the second day of travel, Sage had settled into the rhythm of the rails, the steady click of iron wheels, the occasional whistle, the gentle sway of the passenger car. She often found herself staring out the window, wondering about the man she had never known, James Philip Honaker, a grandfather she had never met, a gunsmith, a watchmaker, a respected businessman, a murder victim. And now, somehow, the reason she was crossing half the country alone. Outside the window, the scenery continued to change. The mountains slowly flattened into rolling grasslands. The grasslands stretched into endless horizons. Golden fields seemed to run forever beneath enormous western skies. Sage rested her book in her lap and watched the world pass by. Somewhere beyond that horizon, waited Virginia City, the town where her grandfather had lived, the town where he had died, and perhaps the town where she would finally discover the truth. She was so lost in thought that she barely noticed the elderly railroad conductor pause beside her seat. The silver-haired conductor studied her ticket for a moment, then looked at her more carefully. His expression changed, as though he had just recognized a name he never expected to see again. "Miss Honaker?" Sage looked up. "Yes, sir?" The old conductor smiled. "Would you mind if I sat down for a moment?" The old conductor remained with Sage for nearly an hour. What began as simple conversation soon became something far more meaningful. He shared stories about James Philip Honaker that Sage had never heard before. Stories of a man respected by railroad workers across Montana. A man known for repairing watches long after his workday ended. A man who never turned away someone in need. Several times Sage found herself smiling. For the first time in her life, she wasn't hearing about her grandfather from old newspaper clippings or family stories. She was hearing about him from someone who had actually known him. When the conductor finally rose to leave, he paused beside her seat. "Your grandfather was one of the finest men I ever knew." Sage looked up. "Thank you for telling me about him." The old conductor smiled. Some people deserve to be remembered. Then he adjusted his cap. And some truths have a way of waiting until the right person comes along. Before Sage could ask what he meant, he tipped his hat and continued down the aisle, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Hours later, the train arrived in St. Louis. The station was crowded and noisy. Steam drifted between platforms while passengers hurried in every direction. Sage gathered her belongings and stepped down onto the platform. For a moment, she looked back. The old conductor stood near the rear passenger car speaking with another railway employee. As though sensing her gaze, he looked up. The two exchanged a small nod. Then the crowd moved between them. And just like that, he was gone. Sage never even learned his name. A short time later, she boarded her second train. The train that would carry her farther west than she had ever imagined. Toward Montana Territory. Toward Virginia City. Toward answers. As the miles passed beneath the wheels, the country continued to change. The green hills of the east slowly disappeared. The land opened into endless stretches of prairie. Golden grass swayed beneath vast skies. Rivers wound through distant valleys. Occasionally, a lonely farmhouse appeared on the horizon before disappearing behind them. Sage spent hours watching through the window, sometimes reading, sometimes writing notes, but most often simply thinking about her grandmother, thinking about Willard, thinking about the old shop waiting somewhere in Virginia City, and thinking about the conductor. There had been something unusual in his eyes whenever he spoke about James Philip Honaker. Respect, admiration, and perhaps something else, something he never quite said aloud. More than once she found herself wondering what he had left unsaid. The farther west they traveled, the more certain she became that her grandfather's death was no random act of violence. Too many people remembered him. Too many people spoke carefully when his name was mentioned, and now an old railroad conductor had all but confirmed it. Somewhere ahead, buried beneath years of silence, was a truth waiting to be uncovered. Outside the window, the first mountains of Montana began appearing against the distant horizon. Sage closed her book and watched them grow larger. For the first time since leaving Virginia, she felt she was finally getting close, very close. After days aboard the train, the mountains finally appeared. At first they were only shadows on the horizon, blue shapes rising against the western sky. But hour by hour they grew larger, sharper, more imposing, until they filled the windows of the rail car. Sage closed her book and stared. She had never seen mountains like these. The Appalachians of Virginia were beautiful, gentle, familiar. These mountains were something else entirely, wild, untamed, as if God himself had piled stone upon stone and simply left them where they fell. By late afternoon, the train finally slowed. Steam hissed from the locomotive, porters hurried along the platform, and a sign came into view. Boot, Montana Territory. Sage gathered her belongings and stepped down from the train. For a moment she simply stood there. After traveling more than 2,000 miles from Virginia, she had finally arrived in Montana. The air felt different, cleaner, cooler. The scent of pine drifted down from the surrounding mountains. Around her, Miners, merchants, railroad workers, and travelers moved through the busy station. Some were arriving, others were leaving. Ever one seemed to be headed somewhere. But Sage still had one final leg of her journey remaining. Virginia City, a short distance for Montana, a very long distance for anyone else. The baggage porter helped unload her trunks, 3 large trunks, 1 smaller traveling case, and the satchel she carried herself. After thanking the porter, Sage followed directions toward the stagecoach office. The wooden building sat near the edge of town. Its weathered sign swung gently in the mountain breeze. Stagecoach tickets, Virginia City and Gold Camps. Inside, a clerk sat behind a barred window. Sage stepped forward. "I'll need passage to Virginia City." The clerk glanced up. "Traveling alone?" "Yes, sir." He nodded. "We leave at 5 p.m. "How long is the trip?" The man slid a ticket toward her. 2 days, weather permitting." Sage studied the ticket. 2 more days. After everything she'd already traveled, it hardly seemed to matter. She handed over the fare and tucked the ticket safely into her satchel. In 2 days, she would finally reach the town she'd crossed the country to find. The stagecoach departed Butte at 5 p.m. sharp. 4 powerful horses pulled the heavy coach south through mountain valleys and winding roads that seemed to disappear into the wilderness. Sage settled into her seat beside the window. The farther they traveled, the more beautiful Montana became. Towering peaks rose in every direction. Snow still clung to distant mountain ridges. Crystal streams cut through valleys below. Several times, Sage found herself wishing her grandmother could have seen it. The journey was rough. Dust found its way through every crack in the coach. The roads were uneven. Sleep came only in short stretches. Yet somehow Sage didn't mind. Every mile carried her closer to Virginia City, closer to the truth. The stagecoach stopped occasionally at small settlements and trading posts. Passengers came and went. Most remained only a short time. Then late on the second afternoon, the coach stopped at a small mountain town several miles outside Virginia City. A lone passenger climbed aboard carrying only a worn leather bag. He appeared to be in his 40s, well-dressed, clean-shaven, yet strangely uneasy. He paid the driver, took a seat toward the rear, and spent the next several hours speaking to absolutely no one. Several times Sage noticed him glancing toward the road behind them, watching, waiting, as though he expected someone to appear. The behavior struck her as odd, but she said nothing. The afternoon slowly faded. Mountains rolled past the windows. The coach rattled across narrow bridges and rough roads. Finally, the driver called back, "Virginia City ahead!" Passengers began gathering their belongings. The quiet stranger suddenly leaned forward. For the first time all day, he spoke. "You said you're from Virginia?" Sage looked up. "Yes, sir." "And your name?" "Sage Honaker." The man's expression changed, only for a moment, but Sage noticed. "Honaker?" "Yes." The stranger looked toward the approaching town. "You have family in Virginia City?" "My grandfather lived here." The man became very still. For several seconds he said nothing, then quietly asked, "James Honaker?" Now Sage felt her own surprise. "You knew him?" The stranger looked away. "Knew of him." The answer sounded rehearsed, careful, as though he had chosen each word before speaking. The stagecoach rattled over another bridge. Virginia City now visible ahead, buildings stretching along the valley floor, smoke rising from chimneys, lights beginning to glow in the fading daylight. Sage leaned forward. "How did you know him?" The man hesitated, long enough for her to notice, then forced a smile. Most folks around here knew the name. Something felt wrong, incomplete. Before she could ask another question, the stagecoach rolled to a stop. The stranger immediately stood, far too quickly. He grabbed his bag, tipped his hat politely, and moved toward the door. "Good evening, Miss Honaker." "Wait." The man paused. "If you knew my grandfather—" But he was already stepping down from the coach. Within seconds, he disappeared into the crowd. Walking faster than anyone carrying luggage should have been walking, almost running, as though he wanted to avoid another question. Sage watched from the window, confused. The stranger never once looked back. And then he was gone. Only moments later, the driver called out, "Virginia City! End of the line!" Sage gathered her belongings and stepped down from the stagecoach. For a moment, she simply stood there. The town stretched before her exactly as her grandfather might have seen it years earlier. Boardwalks, hotels, mercantile stores, saloons, wagons moving through the streets, miners and businessmen crowding the sidewalks, and somewhere within that town lay the answers she had crossed the country to find. Behind her, workers unloaded the trunks. Ahead of her stood Virginia City, the place where James Philip Honaker had lived, the place where he had died, and perhaps the place where someone still knew why. By the time Sage stepped down from the stagecoach, the sun was beginning its slow descent behind the mountains. Virginia City was larger than she expected. Boardwalks stretched along muddy streets. Wagons rattled past storefronts. Miners, merchants, gamblers, and travelers crowded every corner of town. For a moment, she simply stood beside her trunks and took it all in. This was the place, the town her grandfather had called home, the town where he had spent his final years. And somewhere inside those streets, Sage believed answers were waiting. After arranging for her luggage to be unloaded, she set out to find a room for the night. The first hotel she visited displayed a freshly hung sign, "No vacancy." The owner apologized and explained that several mining companies had brought in new crews that week. Every room had been rented. Sage thanked her and continued down the boardwalk. The second boarding house offered no better news. Again, she found the same sign hanging in the doorway, "No vacancy." A tired clerk informed her that every bed in the building had been occupied for nearly 2 weeks. Sage forced a smile and thanked her before stepping back into the street. For the first time since arriving, concern began creeping into her thoughts. The stagecoach had arrived late. Night would soon be falling, and she still had nowhere to stay. Carrying her handbag and leaving the trunks under watch near the depot, Sage walked farther into town. The stranger from the stagecoach crossed her mind. The way he had reacted to her grandfather's name. The way he had practically fled the coach upon arrival. Something about that encounter bothered her, yet she couldn't explain why. As she paused beneath an awning, a man stepped from a nearby office. A silver star reflected sunlight from his vest. The sheriff. He noticed the travel-worn young woman studying the street. "You look lost, miss." Sage smiled politely. "I'm beginning to feel that way." The sheriff chuckled. "Looking for a room?" "Yes, sir." He removed his hat and scratched his head. "Bad timing." "I've gathered that." The sheriff nodded. "Men and boom. Every hotel and boarding house in town is full." Sage sighed quietly. "That's what everyone keeps telling me." The sheriff studied her for a moment, then pointed farther down the street. "There may be one place left." Sage followed his finger. Across town stood a large building with a sign hanging over the entrance. Scarlett Belle Hotel and Saloon. Sage looked back at him. "A saloon?" The sheriff grinned. "Not usually what I'd recommend to a lady traveling alone." "That's reassuring," he laughed. "But Scarlett Belle runs a respectable establishment. Better than half the hotels in town, if you ask me. You know the owner? Everyone knows Scarlett." The sheriff lowered his voice slightly. "She's got a soft spot for stranded travelers." Sage glanced again toward the building. The thought of staying above a saloon made her uncomfortable. Yet the alternative was spending the night without a room. "I suppose I don't have much choice." "No, ma'am, not tonight." Thanking the sheriff, Sage headed down the boardwalk. As she approached the building, she noticed warm light glowing through the windows. Laughter drifted out into the street. Music played somewhere inside. A baggage porter pushed her trunks along behind her. The sign overhead swayed gently in the evening breeze. Scarlett Belle Hotel and Saloon. Sage stopped at the entrance. She had crossed half a continent to reach Virginia City, yet somehow, after thousands of miles of trains, stages, and mountains, she found herself standing outside a saloon. Before she could gather the courage to enter, the door suddenly opened. A beautiful dark-haired woman stepped onto the boardwalk, confident, elegant, and smiling as though she had been expecting her. The woman looked Sage up and down. Then her eyes settled on the stack of travel trunks. "Well now," she said warmly, "you look like someone who's traveled a very long way." For the first time that day, Sage felt a small sense of relief. Perhaps she'd finally found a friend. Scarlett smiled warmly as Sage stepped inside. The saloon was nothing like she expected. Instead of drunken chaos and trouble, she found polished wood floors, warm lantern light, rich wallpaper, and the hum of civilized conversation. Several businessmen sat discussing mining investments. Travelers shared meals near the dining room. A piano played softly in the corner. For the first time since leaving Virginia, Sage felt safe. Scarlett introduced herself and welcomed Sage as though they were old friends. Within minutes, the room ledger was opened. A room was available, the last room. Sage paid for 2 nights and thanked her. "You arrived just in time, honey," Scarlett said with a grin. "Another hour and I'd have rented it myself." A porter soon arrived and gathered Sage's trunks. Together they climbed the staircase overlooking the saloon floor below. The higher they climbed, the quieter the building became. By the second floor, the sounds of conversation and piano music faded into the background. Scarlett stopped before a door near the end of the hallway. She turned the brass key and pushed it open. "Welcome to Virginia City, Miss Honaker." Sage stepped inside. Her breath caught. The room was beautiful, far more elegant than anything she expected to find above a saloon. A large carved bed stood against the wall. Oil lamps glowed warmly beside polished furniture. Fresh linens covered the mattress. Heavy curtains framed the windows. The room carried the quiet comfort of a place carefully cared for. The porter rolled her trunks inside and placed them near the bed. Scarlett smiled. "If you need anything, just ask." "Thank you," Sage said sincerely. "I believe this may be the nicest room I've seen since leaving home." Scarlett laughed. "Then I suppose we're off to a good start." After the door closed, Sage stood alone in silence. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to relax. The journey was finally over, at least for now. She carefully unpacked a few dresses and personal belongings. Then she sat before the vanity mirror and slowly removed the pins from her hair. Golden waves tumbled down around her shoulders. Outside her window, Virginia City continued bustling with life. Inside, however, everything was still. Sage studied her reflection. So much had changed in such a short time. Her grandmother was gone. The Honaker house belonged to someone else. Willard was hundreds of miles away. Virginia was behind her. And yet somehow she felt closer to her grandfather than ever before. Her eyes drifted toward the silver pocket watch resting atop one of the trunks. The mysterious watch, the hidden note, the number 317, the same number she had seen on the train. In that photograph that carried her grandfather's body home years ago. Then her thoughts wandered to the old conductor, the strange look on his face when she mentioned James Honaker, the warning he never quite finished. And finally she thought of the man from the stagecoach, the quiet traveler who had listened closely when she spoke of her grandfather, the man who suddenly became nervous, the man who rushed away the moment they reached Virginia City. Something connected them. She could feel it. She simply didn't know how. Not yet. Outside, the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the Montana mountains. Lanterns began glowing across town. Tomorrow, she would begin searching for answers. Tomorrow, she would visit the places her grandfather once worked. Tomorrow, she would start uncovering the truth. But tonight, for the first time since leaving Honaker, Virginia, Sage allowed herself a moment of peace. She sat quietly beside the window, watching darkness settle over Virginia City, completely unaware that the answers she sought were already closer than she imagined. Tune back in for part 4 when Sage starts investigating about her grandfather.